Alrighty, we will probably go ahead and get started here in the next 30 seconds or so. Just give everyone a chance to hop on. Okay, well, hello everybody. First and foremost, thank you so much for joining us for our NAAC and Eligibility Center webinar here. My name is Marisa Brisbane, and I am the Assistant Director of Compliance at the University of Maryland. And I'm joined by Conor here, who I'll let introduce himself in a second. We, again, just want to thank you for joining us. We're hoping that you find this webinar beneficial. As promoted, we're sort of targeting newer compliance people or people who want a refresher in initial eligibility reminders and how to utilize the Eligibility Center. So, Conor, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone on the East Coast. Good morning to anyone on the West Coast and anyone watching this recording. Good day, and thanks for joining us. My name is Conor Larkin. I'm the Assistant Director of Customer Service at the NCAA Eligibility Center, and it's great to be here with Marisa. And it's great to be collaborating with the NAAC Education Committee to deliver this content for new compliance administrators. So let's get started into this. For today's agenda, Marisa and I will primarily focus on helping you navigate the EC membership portal because as a new compliance administrator, mastering the different sections of the EC portal is going to help you take your compliance game to the next level and ensure that you are working efficiently and effectively with your coaches and recruits. Next on the agenda, we're going to walk you through the PSA details report and point out key areas that you'll need to analyze for each recruit to make sure you're consistently and accurately monitoring the certification process for your institution's recruits. And then finally, I'm also going to talk about some upcoming changes to the EC's academic record submission policies and then field any questions that this audience may have for us. This is our first joint NAAC and EC webinar, and Marisa will take a few moments to cover our future plans for this series.
Awesome. Thanks, Conor. So as he mentioned, we're looking at hopefully doing a multi-part series here to really just help lay the foundation for the Eligibility Center. I think, especially for newer compliance administrators, if you log into the EC for the first time, it can definitely be overwhelming. There's a lot that goes into it, but I've always liked to say that the Eligibility Center is the front lines of being a student athlete in college athletics. You have to get through the EC before you can get to campus. So first in this webinar, as he mentioned, we're really going to talk about activation and initial review. So how do you get started? How do you get a prospective student athlete on your institutional request list, things like that? Then hopefully coming next year, we'll transition, talk a little bit more about monitoring updates, some follow-up action, and then ultimately post-certification reviews and remedies if there are any concerns in the initial eligibility process. So to get us started, Conor's going to talk a little bit about navigating the membership portal.
All right, thanks, Marisa. Now, there are a lot of different sections and functions within the EC portal that you'll eventually need to learn, but for today's coverage, we're going to focus specifically on activating and reviewing accounts. Now, as Marisa just mentioned, we plan to deliver additional webinars in the future. And in those future webinars, we're going to walk you through other sections of the EC portal that will come into play in the later certification stages that she just mentioned. So for today's approach to navigating the EC membership portal, we'll start by reviewing the IRL activation process to help you understand how to activate accounts for your students that your institution is recruiting. And by the way, the term IRL is an acronym that stands for Institutional Request List, which is a signal to the EC staff that your recruit that you're activating needs their academic and or amateurism certifications to be processed by the EC staff. We'll also cover the Reports tab, which you will use to access student information and compile reports for yourself and for your athletics colleagues. And next, we'll walk through the new matriculation letter submission process, which is a brand new feature that we recently added to the EC portal back in September, and also discuss briefly about contacting the EC staff. So let's get started with the account activation steps. To activate an account, simply navigate to the IRL tab and select the IRL activation option from the drop-down menu. To activate an account, simply select the IRL activation tab, which pulls up the IRL activation search page. On this page, you can enter student information to hopefully locate the student's account that you want to activate to your institution's IRL. Now, you can enter in different information that you have received in the different search fields on there, and you can also filter by the account type. And I specifically recommend using the all account type filter whenever possible, although on this slide, you can see that we've selected the academic and amateurism only accounts, which reflect the 2 certification accounts that the Eligibility Center offers to students that are registering with the EC. But there's also a profile page option there if you want to filter by that. But again, I recommend using the all account types option when you're searching for students to activate. So I guess as an initial question, and this is for Marisa, and for this audience, can you, I guess, tell us how you typically collect this information? Is there like a set process in place, or do you always require the coaches to communicate the NCAA ID number to you? Or do they just simply walk into your office and provide you names and demographic information? How does this, I guess, process work on your campus?
Yeah, I think this is one of those things we hope to get as much information as we can, right? So in a perfect world, every time a coach started recruiting someone, we would get an ID number. If they're registered, they have a paid account and they'll pop up, we activate them and we're good to go. But more realistically, I would say more often than not, we usually get a name. Hopefully it's spelled correctly. And ideally, I always request at least a birthday as well that we could pull from a transcript or ask the student for, just because we want to make sure that we're activating the correct person. So at my institution that I currently work at, we always try and get this first thing as soon as a kid is on a coach's radar. We ask for the ID number. And then if they can't get that number, like I said, minimum first and last name, we know their sport, and we get their date of birth in there so we can verify that we're navigating the correct person.
Great, thanks for sharing that. So after you enter that information, that's going to take you to the search results page that Marisa will walk you through.
Yes. So once you get that ID number, you get that person in the system, we have to do one of the most important things in the Eligibility Center, actually go through that process of assigning them to a team and a year so we can activate them and place them onto our institutional request list. So in order to do this, as you can see here, you select the sport in that first section, you can toggle over. One of the biggest things I think that can be mistaken is sometimes forgetting to switch that year over, especially as we're sort of transition between mid-years and people coming next fall. So always making sure you check that recruitment cycle. One thing, Conor, I have a question for you. Do you think that you see quite often, or do you hear quite often about students being placed on the wrong IRL, the wrong year, or asking questions about where do you put a mid-year if they're coming in at mid-year?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do see this happen from time to time. So for the recruitment cycle that you're selecting for the specific academic year that the student is being recruited for. So on this slide here, it's selected for the 23-24 academic year, meaning the student is either enrolling in the fall of 23 term or the winter spring of 24 term. But if your coaches are approaching you and saying, hey, I need the student activated, they give you the ID number, the name and date of birth. And this is for the fall 24 or winter spring 25 term, you're going to toggle that recruitment cycle section to the 24-25 IRL cycle. And then, of course, click the box next to their ID number. If they're a transfer student, you may want to use that box there to confirm that the student may be an incoming transfer student from another institution. And then click the activate button at the bottom. So on occasion, we do see institutions who have students who were recruited for a prior cycle, and maybe the student is delaying their enrollment to a future cycle, and they just don't update that IRL for the correct recruitment cycle. So just make sure that you're actively managing the IRL list and the recruitment cycle for the students your institution is recruiting.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
I was going to say, I think that's a good transition into sort of some tips and tricks that you might be able to add to that when you are activating a student athlete for the first time.
Yeah, and as you can see, the activation process is relatively simple, but it is ultimately the first step in the overall certification process. And by the way, if your institution is no longer like recruiting a student, you should, of course, deactivate the account using the IRL deactivation process, which is basically following the same steps, but instead of using the IRL activation tab, you'll want to select the IRL deactivation tab from the IRL drop-down menu on your portal. And we encourage compliance administrators to actively manage the institution request list that you're monitoring, which will help you and the EC staff focus on the students that your institution is recruiting. So say, for instance, the student has signed an NLI to another school, you may want to log in and deactivate that student's account. Again, our focus should be on the students that your institution is actively recruiting. Now, on that note, and as Marisa just mentioned, there's a couple of tips that I want to share for the new compliance administrators, as well as those who are experienced compliance administrators, stuff that comes up from time to time on the calls and emails that you send my office. First, as a best practice, I encourage you to try to get the ID number and just enter that ID number without any other details For instance, if you add a name, it might return no search results. So as an example, if mom and dad registered the student under the name Thomas, but the student's saying to the coach, my name is Tom, and you're searching by Tom and not by Thomas, you might not get any search results. So making sure you start with the ID number can be a best practice here. Other items that could come up are students who have hyphenated last names or unique spellings if they're like an international student, or in some countries or cultures, there may be multiple last names that the student has used to register in their account. It may take a little extra effort for you to find the account that they have created. So as again, a best practice, I just recommend starting with the ID number and also filtering by all account types, as I just had mentioned a few moments ago. And then when you get to the search results page, you'll also want to cross-check the type of account that the student has created. So for instance, if you have an incoming freshman that has created an amateurism-only account, you know that they may need to transition their account to the full academic and amateurism certification account because, of course, if you're a Division I or Division II compliance administrator, you know that the EC needs to complete an academic certification to determine if that student can compete in their initial year. And that process is pretty simple. You would just direct the student to log into their account, and on their dashboard, there's items on that dashboard that instruct the student on how to transition the account to the appropriate account type, and they can typically complete that process relatively quickly. And that, of course, will make sure that the student has the correct account type for enrollment at your institution. Another thing that can come up is if a parent registers, they may be entering their own date of birth versus the student's date of birth. We've seen that on a number of occasions. You, of course, can use that date of birth, but if you're not getting those search results that you're looking for, you may want to remove that search criteria. Another thing I recommend doing is whenever possible, if you're not using the ID number, but you're entering the student's name, and that's perfectly fine, of course, like Marisa said, that's her practice on campus. But in some cases, you might find the student or their family has created more than one account, which we in the EC call duplicative accounts. Now, if you see multiple search results, your first step should be to contact the EC staff so that we can review those accounts and determine which one we would want to keep for ongoing certification purposes. I'll also note for this audience that the EC recently implemented a duplicative account prevention process that is basically aimed at restricting students and their families from creating more than one account. So you may continue to find more than one account for some students who have registered in the past, back in the sophomore or junior year of high school. They may have created additional accounts beyond that. This process was implemented in August. So while you may continue to see duplicative accounts for this current cycle, we anticipate that this number should quickly diminish as we proceed through the upcoming cycles. Now, third and finally, and this is maybe the biggest one that we get a lot of calls on, is let's say you've entered the ID number, you're using the all account types filter, but you're just not finding the account in the search results page. You've entered the student's name, still not finding anything. In fact, maybe the student's even sending a screenshot of their account and they're saying, hey, I absolutely have registered with the EC, and you're trying to figure out like why you can't find that account in the search results page. In this case, this should signal to you that the student has in fact created a certification account, but it presently has an incomplete payment status. And you should direct the student to log into their certification account and complete that payment step, which is simply completed by selecting the account settings option on their account. And once they do that, on the left-hand side, there will be a payment button, which if they click that and follow the prompts, they'll get to the payment page where they can complete the payment. The reason why you won't be able to find the account for a certification account that doesn't have a payment status on it is that these accounts are suppressed from the IRL activation search results page. So make sure that if you see this type of scenario, your immediate reaction should be to tell the student to log into their account and complete the payment step. Now that brings us to the next section, which is the search student details page. You've just activated the account, and the next step really is to crack open the account and dive into those details. Now, to do this, you'll select the Search Student Details option, which is located under the Reports tab, and enter the ID number you just activated, and then click the Search button at the bottom of that page. Now, the Search Student Details page is an excellent page to isolate and extract different accounts that meet the specific search criteria that you've entered. And the different search filters are provided at the bottom of the page. So for instance, if you want to, let's say, assess the status of your international students, you can select that search filter if you want to review those accounts and determine where those students stand in terms of completing the certification process and in terms of what their academic decisions are and amateurism decisions are. Or let's say you want to look at a specific team, you can select for a specific sport. Like if you just want to look at the baseball students, you can select the men's sports or women's sports. Maybe in April or May, you want to check out which students have not yet requested final amateurism certification. You can click the no box next to that first line item in the search criteria to find those accounts and determine which students haven't done this, and then filter that down to your coaches and make sure that they follow up with those students to make sure they're logging in and requesting final amateurism certification. And make sure you're also selecting for the correct recruitment cycle. In this case, it's selected for the 23-24 cycle, which represents the 23-24 academic year. But eventually, you'll need to start toggling this to the 24-25 cycle to get the correct search results for the students enrolling in the future cycles. Now, once you've entered, let's say you enter the ID number and click the search button at the bottom, this is going to take you to the next page, which is the student details page. And what you'll see is a long row of information that's ported onto this page. Now, in this case, if you're searching for just one ID number, you'll just see one row. But if you're selecting for a full team, you might see a long list of students on this search details result. In this case, we just used a single ID number, and this is what you would see if you do this. The search results page is very long, and on this screen, you'll see what I consider the front 9 or the first 9 columns that starts with that student's ID number, and then their name, then the recruitment cycle next to that, and then the enrollment period, which, by the way, must be specific to the student's initial term of full-time enrollment at any NCAA institution. So that includes Division I, Division II, or NCAA Division III schools. And then it also reflects the account type under that. On the next column, you'll see whether the student has assigned NLI and also whether, and the next column to that, whether the student was designated as a transfer student, which you can, as we mentioned on the IRL activation page, you can select that to make sure the student would appear as a transfer student in this detail page. And you can also use that as a search criteria on the search student details page itself if you want to monitor and manage those incoming transfer students. And then on the next column, you'll see the amateurism certification status. In this case, you'll see that the student is preliminarily reviewed for their amateurism certification, but you might see other statuses like final decisions or a pending review status, which tends to indicate that there are open amateurism related tasks that the student needs to complete, which ultimately leads to a formal review by our case processors in the Eligibility Center. And then the next column over is a designation on whether the student has requested final amateurism certification. In this case, the student hasn't done this. And then finally, on that final column on this slide, you'll see whether the account is ready to process for a final academic certification, meaning that we have all the transcripts on file from all sources of credit and proof of graduation on file. In this case, the field is blank, indicating that we have no final transcript or proof of graduation on this account. Now, if you're looking at this, one thing that should stand out is that you have the student with a fall 23 enrollment period likely on your campus, and this student not only has not requested final amateurism certification, but also doesn't have a final amateurism certification itself, which should signal to you to follow up with your coaches that student is trying for the sport that student is trying to participate in, and check in with them to see what they've been doing, because you may have a student who is participating without that final amateurism certification, which could be a red flag for you and require some additional follow-up work with your coaches and athletics department staff members. Now that's the front 9. On the next slide, you'll see the back 9 columns, which are mostly specific to the academic certifications that the EC staff completes. In the first 2 columns, you'll see the academic certification status based on the review of the student's transcripts. In this case, this student has met the early academic qualifier standards for both Divisions 1 and 2, which if you've read through the legislation, you'll know that proof of graduation is not required to meet the early academic qualifier standards. So it's perfectly fine not to have proof of graduation on file for this decision. And that's why on that prior slide, there was no proof of graduation, there was no academic ready to process for the final academic certification field populated. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're going through these columns. Now on the next 2 columns, you might see an old model decision, which is specific to your international recruits who have, let's say they've presented international forms of proof of graduation, such as leaving certificates, GCSEs if they're from the UK, or leaving diplomas. Just depends on the country where they were educated in and completed their secondary education. Now this field may be populated if we are able to complete an old model evaluation based on those leaving certificates or leaving diplomas. But in this case, you don't see any information ported into this, meaning that the student is in all likelihood not an international student. And to be clear, because we get this question quite a bit, for international students, they only need to meet competition standards under one model of evaluation or another. So either the transcript-based model, which is ported into the academic Division I and academic Division II columns on the left-hand side of this slide, or the old model, which would be ported into the next two adjacent columns. So again, you're just looking for the student meeting competition standards under one model or the other. Those international students do not need to meet competition standards under both models. Again, that's a frequently asked question that we get in the customer service team. Now, to the right of this, you'll see a GPA calculated for both Divisions 1 and 2, and the old model GPA field, which if an old model certification has been completed, you'll see a GPA ported into that column. And by the way, we'll continue processing old model certifications for the foreseeable future, which is another common question that we get. So just kind of keep that in mind, that we'll continue doing this as far as we can tell. Now, in between, you'll see a column for whether we have all transcripts received on the account from each source of credit. Now, if you don't see received in this column, that means we're missing a transcript from a high school. And that should alert you to investigate the student's task list to determine which school that transcript is missing from. And I'll cover that in just a few moments when we dive into the PSA details report. The next column over is the final transcript proof of graduation field, which of course says whether we have a final transcript and proof of graduation on file. And again, it's okay for the student not to have this field populated, since the early academic qualifier standards do not require proof of graduation. But keep in mind that the early academic qualifier bylaw specifies a final transcript submission requirement, which is specific to Division I and Division II. There's two separate rules there for your division. So make sure you check out this bylaw for your division-specific requirements on reporting those final transcripts to the Eligibility Center. And that's kind of the student details report. And that takes us to another type of report that we want to run, which is contained within the additional reports section. And you can obtain those additional reports by selecting the reports option at the top and selecting additional reports from the drop-down menu. It's the second option in that drop-down menu. Now, if you select that option, you'll see a selection of reports that you can run. And on this page, this is what you'll see. You'll see the No CCL report, the Open Task Action Required report, among several others. Now, I've selected the box here for the Open Tasks Report All for the 23-24 cycle. And if you run this report, it's going to populate a list of accounts that have open tasks for all students that are activated to the 23-24 cycle. But if you want to look at the Open Task Report for all your students for the 24-25 cycle, you'll have to toggle that recruitment cycle option to the 24-25 cycle. Now, the Open Task Action Required report is one report that you should consistently run and monitor from a compliance standpoint. And this report is going to provide additional information about the types of tasks that you in the compliance office will need to assess and remedy. So that takes us to the next slide, where you can see a list of those types of tasks that may appear in this Open Tasks Report Action Required. So as you can see, for the men's swimmer and diver, there's an enrollment verification document needed task that's assigned. That's specific to the amateurism review. That's requesting a matriculation letter for the amateurism certification processing of that account. For the baseball students, you see a matriculation letter needed, which is also asking for a matriculation letter. And that's specific to the completing the academic certification for those two baseball students. But you also see the incomplete sports participation response task assigned to the women's volleyball player. Other types of tasks that you may see in this section include some complex amateurism-related tasks that also require institutional involvement. So this is not a long list of tasks on this report, and this is a type of institution that's on top of their game. But if you see a long list of tasks and a long list of accounts on this, you may want to do some extra work to make sure that those students are responding to those tasks and that you're actively monitoring and submitting matriculation dates, which is a process I'll walk through you in just a moment. We have one question in the chat here asking whether final proof of graduation has to be received for early academic qualifiers. That goes back to the prior slide. That's an excellent question. So ultimately, what is required on the final transcript bylaw is the submission of a final transcript. There's no specific details saying that proof of graduation has to be on it, but by and large, final transcripts do have proof of graduation on them. And ultimately, those need to be submitted by division-specific dates. So if you look at the Division I rules, it'll say that the early academic qualifiers need to have their final transcripts submitted to the Eligibility Center officially or unofficially by February 1st after their fall enrollment, or if they're mid-year enrollees, it would be the following February 1st. Now, if you're a Division II institution, you need those final transcripts on file after fall enrollment by, I believe, November 15th. You'll have to double check that bylaw, but I believe that's the date. But to answer the question directly, just the final transcripts need to be on file, and they can be submitted officially or unofficially. Now, let's take a look at some of the additional reports, recommendations that I have. And from a recommendation standpoint, again, I want to encourage everyone in this audience to run the Open Task Action Required report to monitor the students who have, let's say, the incomplete sports participation tasks, which are assigned to accounts when the student has registered, they've answered basically no to all sports participation questions. Now, if you have a walk-on student, that may be accurate. They may not have any sports participation background to report to the Eligibility Center. But for the students that are signing NLIs or for the international students, there tends to be a significant amount of sports participation information that they need to provide. And if you see that task assigned to their account, you're going to want to follow up with your coach and that student to make sure they're logging into their account, going to the sports questions section, and answering all of those questions to the best of their ability. Another thing you'll see is the requirement to submit matriculation dates. And again, I'll cover that process in just a moment. You're looking for the matriculation letter needed task, which is specific, again, to completing the academic certifications, or the enrollment verification document needed task, which is specific to completing the amateurism reviews. Both of those tasks are simply requesting matriculation dates to be entered on the account. And once you do, those tasks will close and those students will be removed from that additional report with the Open Task Action Required report. One other report that you'll want to run is the No CCL report, and CCL stands for Core Course List. So in this case, this report reflects the students who have attended schools that do not have a core course list. And this is important to run as often as you can because of what it takes to get schools, the high schools rather, to get cleared and to populate those core course lists. And if you see a student on this list, that means they have a source of credit where we cannot, for our academic certifications, review those transcripts and enter coursework from those transcripts. So again, if you see a student's account on this No CCL report, I would highly encourage you to contact the customer service team and get a status check on what's going on with that high school. Have they completed registration? Are they actively responding to tasks we've assigned to their high school account within their high school portal, or something else? And we can help you determine where that high school is in terms of the review process. It's very possible a student may appear on this list after the school has been cleared, but they have not yet taken that additional step to populate their list of courses. So there could be any number of reasons why a student lands on this No CCL report. And again, with the work that's involved there, you'll want to take immediate action and connect with the customer service team to understand where things stand with those particular high schools and those particular students. Now that takes us to the end of the additional reports, and I want to take a few moments to walk you through the matriculation letter process. Now again, going back to the Open Tasks Report Action Required section, if you see accounts with the matriculation letter needed task or the enrollment verification document needed task, this should signal to you that you would need to eventually submit a matriculation date for those accounts. And to do this, you'll simply navigate to the Resources tab's drop-down menu and select the matriculation letter option at the bottom of that drop-down menu. This will take you to the search page where you can enter the student information, but I generally recommend running a report for all students who have open matriculation letter tasks, which you can see on the next slide. At the bottom, there's a line item that we've populated with the yes button. It says PSA has open matriculation letter tasks. If you click yes and maybe select all sports, you're going to get a whole a global list of the students where those matriculation dates are required. Now, if you just enter the ID number and click the search results, you'll get that one account on the search results page, and then you'll click the box next to that ID number and click the submit button at the bottom, and that's going to take you to the matriculation date entry page. Now, once you get to the search results and you click the box next to the student's ID number and get to that matriculation date entry page with the orange bar at the top, you'll notice a lot of details here. For instance, the student's enrollment period, which For the second time, I'll say that this needs to be specific to the student's initial full-time enrollment at any NCAA Division I, Division II, or Division III institution. It also have the student's ID number and their name, information that the student may have provided during the registration process about other enrollment in higher education, which is maybe populated in those next two fields beneath that. They may provide a date and may provide the name of that institution. So you want to check on that. And then in the next field, that's where you're going to populate the matriculation date. And again, this is going to be different from the enrollment period. This matriculation date is specific to the student's initial full-time enrollment at any institution of higher education, whether it's an NCAA school, could be another four-year institution like an NAIA school. It could be a two-year junior college or community college, or perhaps for your international transfer students, the name of an international university or college, for instance. But that matriculation date, again, needs to establish the student's initial full-time enrollment in higher education. Now, if it turns out that this occurred at an NCAA school, you'll click next, you'll click yes next to the NCAA school field. And from there, you can select the specific NCAA institution that the student enrolled full-time at. Now, if it's not an NCAA school, you'll select the no field. And from there, you can populate and type in the name of that institution, like let's say a two-year institution or an international institution. So it's a free-form entry there. Once you've done that, you can enter your first and last name, your email address, and your title, then review the affirmation box at the bottom and click that. From there, you'll submit the request, and that matriculation date is going to populate directly into the student's account and close the enrollment verification document needed task or the matriculation letter needed task, or both, if both are assigned to the account. And hopefully that will move the case forward for further review of the academic or amateurism certification itself. Now, there's two things I want to mention in terms of the matriculation letter process. This is a brand new process. Historically speaking, you would have back in time had to go to your admissions or registrar's office and have them fill out the matriculation letter form itself. Then they would have to send it back to you, and then you would have to upload it, and it would take us usually 1 to 2 business days to process that. But this new process that you can complete in your membership portal will allow you to immediately enter those dates very quickly without having to connect with those other offices on campus. However, I do want to have a quick note here on establishing policies and procedures for your campus for this new process now that the athletics departments are permitted to enter these matriculation dates. So I recommend that you develop, if you haven't done this already, developing best practices or policies and procedures before those dates are entered. So for example, who in your athletics department is permitted to enter those matriculation dates? Is it you in the compliance office? Is it the athletics director? Do you want a coach doing this? Probably not, unless that coach is also working in some sort of compliance function at your institution. You may also want to have developed policies and procedures for what type of information is needed to confirm those dates of initial full-time enrollment in higher education, whether it's connecting with your admissions office to confirm those dates, or is this something you can review from like college transcripts that the student has sent you? And then also maybe establish some policies on when those dates should be entered. Is this needing to be done before the student enrolls full-time? Hopefully so, but those policies are up to your institution to develop. Do you want to have these dates entered before the student signs a national letter of intent, or maybe at some point after that? So this is kind of an open option for you to develop these best practices for your campus. And Marisa, just as a quick question, does your institution employ any sort of policies and procedures that you can share with this audience in terms of what you need to review before you enter those matriculation dates?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you touched on it a little bit. So we always make sure that we have all semester transcripts. So from high school, and then whenever they enroll in any institution, whether it's a 2-year, an NAIA school, or another NCAA institution, or potentially an international institution. We just always make sure we are able to track on those transcripts, because if we don't have any missing semesters from the transcripts, it's safe to assume that hopefully we are not sort of missing base there when we're trying to gauge this matriculation date. And I think a big misconception and sometimes error that happens when entering matriculation dates is we just have to remind ourselves, you as the NCAA are asking us, when did this person enroll in college for the first time? When did their clock or their semester start counting? As much as it obviously matters when they enroll at our current institution, I think that's always a good reminder. This is to certify their amateurism, figure out delayed enrollment, figure out what the heck have they been doing since they graduated from high school before they enrolled in your institution, so you can backtrack if they have not yet been certified. So I think that's an important thing to remember when dealing with this matriculation letter stuff, especially as it's changed a little bit and looks a little different than it used to.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks for sharing that, Marissa. And that's an excellent point. Getting those details will help you determine not just what the matriculation date is for that student, but will also inform you about the start of the 5-year clock, or how many semesters they've used in higher education towards the Division II or perhaps the Division III clock. Transfer issues in terms of how to analyze the transfer legislation if you have a transfer student that you're looking at. Progress towards degree issues in terms of analyzing those college transcripts. Of course, you're going to be working with the admissions office to determine which type of coursework is acceptable for a degree program that the student will enroll in at some point. But getting all that additional information is certainly going to be helpful. I imagine on one end of the spectrum, some institutions may feel comfortable entering these matriculation dates for incoming freshmen, where they know that they've never enrolled full time, and you would just enter your institution's own first date of classes on the matriculation date field and entering your own institution on the NCAA school line. But for other institutions on the other end of the spectrum, you may employ a practice where you want all of those dates confirmed and vetted by the admissions office or some other non-athletics department on campus, and make sure that you're always covered in terms of any sort of errors that are made. So there's a spectrum of options here that you can take. And I think, Marissa, your institution has got the sweet spot here in making sure you at least collect all of the academic information from the students' high schools and their other institutions of higher education before entering those dates. So that's great to hear. And again, I think that's a pretty good practice for any institution that's listening in here. Now, let's say hypothetically you've entered an incorrect date. Maybe you get the month and year mixed up, the month and day mixed up. Perhaps instead of, let's say, August 1st, for a full-time enrollment date, you put January 8th. You get those month and days mixed up, you enter that incorrectly. Or let's say you're in a scenario where the student was going to enroll in fall of 23, and you've entered a matriculation date saying the student was going to enroll full-time initially on August 28th, and then the student, for whatever reason, they couldn't get admitted, for instance, or they decide to delay further, and the student is now going to enroll in the winter-spring 24 term. You would then need to revise those dates, and to do this, you would need to submit a revised matriculation letter. So whatever the case is, if you need to change those dates, you would need to submit the revised matriculation letter. And that letter is a formal form. You can't do this electronically. In this case, to revise the dates, you would need to submit the revised matriculation letter form. And that's populated on the screen when you attempt to modify those dates. It's linked there, and it explains that if you're trying to change the date, you would need to submit the revised matriculation letter form. Now, when you submit that, you would need to have this form filled out by your admissions or registrar's office. And they would also need to fill out the revision box at the bottom explaining why you're changing these dates. So for instance, maybe the student has delayed, or perhaps you got mixed up and just entered the wrong information, or perhaps your admissions office discovered that the student was in fact enrolled in higher education at an international university, and you need to revise those dates. That's the type of information you would need to put in that box. And if you have any other additional details like university transcripts, you can also submit that with the revised matriculation letter form. And then from there, once you submit that, EC staff will take a look at that and determine if we can make updates to the matriculation date on that student's account. So those are a couple of key things to remember. Again, developing best practices and understanding how to revise those matriculation dates that have been previously entered on an account. Now, this takes us to our next section, which is about contacting the customer service office. And then I'll let Marissa kind of talk through this about contacting the customer service team.
Yeah, thanks, Conor. So we just wanted to throw this out here, especially for newer compliance administrators who might not be super familiar with how to actually get in touch with people at the Eligibility Center. I know for me personally, when I started working in compliance, it was a huge, huge benefit to be able to shoot an email or pick up the phone and call and work through a problem. Whether it's just not understanding something, whether it's having a question or thinking there's an error. I think contrary to sometimes popular belief, picking up the phone and talking through that, there aren't scary people on the other end of the phone. It's just people working in the Eligibility Center that really want to help us out on campus. And I think being able to communicate through the phone or via email can sometimes be very effective. So there is actually a contact us button at the top of the membership portal. So you can go about that route. There's an email option that our good friend Conor here actually helps manage, so we can touch base with him, or obviously the call-in option. Another thing to keep up, make sure we're keeping up with is your institution's contact list. So make sure if you're onboarding new staff members or transitioning whoever is in your department, that you're updating who is kind of on your contact list for your institution's Eligibility Center account, similar with the rest of your NCAA applications. So if you have questions about updating that, there are some instructions on this slide, but also please feel free to reach out to the Eligibility Center and they can help you work through that. Just some common topics that you can chat through. We put on the slide, just assisting with understanding different tasks on the account. So if you look through, you see something you haven't seen very often, you might have a type of account or a type of designation that you've never seen before. Talking through them and using your resources through the Eligibility Center can always be very beneficial, save you a lot of time, help break it down to coaches better, things like that. Similarly, with different transcript designations, different policies with academics and amateurism, duplicative accounts, if you have one of those pop up, like Conor mentioned, different account analysis, and rectifying some type of academic deficiency, which we'll talk about in a future webinar. So again, just wanted to put out there that contacting them is always a good option. Personally, I've had situations in the past where I'm going through a core course breakdown, I cannot for the life of me figure out why I'm getting a different number of quality points than the EC is. And then finally, after going through it, I pick up the phone and I call, I realize that a grading scale changed a couple years back, things like that. So again, just an effective way to kind of work through and navigate the Eligibility Center, and just a quick reminder that there are people on the other end that are happy to help.
Yeah, thanks, Marisa. Contact the customer service team as often as you need. Think of us as an extension of your compliance office. We're all in to help you and make sure your students get cleared under our policies and procedures. As one of my colleagues in the customer service team says, bad news early is good news. So if you call us early and you get some bad news, well, that's going to be helpful for you and your coaches to determine if you want to continue recruitment of that particular student, or whether they want to move on and focus on other recruits to fill those roster spots. So contacting us early and often will certainly help you and help your coaches as well. So I definitely recommend that. And thanks for Marisa for sharing those details. Now let's move on. We've covered the IRL activation process, searching for student details and the additional reports you can run, the brand new matriculation letter process that we launched back in September of 23. Now we want to dive into the PSA detail report and kind of cover the different points of analysis that you need to walk through when you're starting to look at the students' accounts. Items that you'll want to focus in on are the key dates, the review registration link, the academic and amateurism certification statuses, the high school information, and the student's task list, which you'll find at the very bottom of that PSA detail report. Now, to access this PSA detail report, what you'll need to do is use the Search Student Detail option, enter that ID number, and click Search at the bottom of the page there. And then on the student detail page, click the box next to their ID number, and then at the bottom, click the Get PSA Details that you'll find at the bottom of the page. And that's going to take you to the PSA detail report. Now, from an analysis standpoint, the first thing I do I look at the key dates. So looking at the student's self-reported graduation date and the EC graduation date that we've entered, maybe after we've processed international mail or attempted a preliminary academic certification, you may note that those dates are different. And if you see those dates are different, maybe the student's saying I graduated in June of 23, but the EC grad date is listed as June of 22. That may signal that you need to do some follow-up work, whether it's to contact customer service and figure out why those dates are different, or follow up with the student to determine why they said they graduated on this particular date and why the EC has set a different date, primarily because the EC grad date is aligned with the student's expected date of graduation, whereas the student may have only entered their actual date of graduation. And those differences of dates can be important for both the academic and amateurism certifications that we conduct and the outcome of those reviews. Another thing I check out, and probably the first thing I check out, is the student's enrollment period. Again, and I've probably said this twice and now a third time, that the enrollment period should reflect the student's initial term of full-time enrollment at any NCAA school. So checking on that, making sure that's accurate. You can check out the date of birth. That's another thing that could come up maybe for the men's ice hockey and skiers for Division I, or the tennis players going Division I for the 20th birthday rule. So checking out those birth dates can be helpful. And then I also check out the academic decision and amateurism decision dates in terms of when I start looking at accounts myself when you contact us. Another thing you can check out is the print search status report. And I recommend using this whenever possible. It's linked at the bottom of the PSA detail report, and it'll help you obtain a snapshot of the account as it stands when you run this option. And it'll basically capture information on that specific date that you're reviewing the account. And you'll see different dates and data entered on this report, and then you can share this with your coaches. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see what that looks like. You'll see the student's ID number, their enrollment period, the registration date, the student's phone number, the sport they're participating in, and the activation date. Things like that can be helpful for you to have further discussions with your coaches in terms of ongoing recruitment efforts. So this is what the Print Cert Status Report looks like. And I know a lot of institutions will download copies of these and archive them for future reference points as the academic certifications are updated, or eventually amateurism certifications are being completed, and having that reference point to look back at where things stood back in time to help you in navigating the completion of the certification process itself for your recruits. Now, this takes us to the next thing, and I think this is mainly maybe the most important thing to check out on an account, and that's the view registration data. And I'll let Marisa talk you through this process.
Yeah, we really want to add to this to the presentation, primarily because I think some people may think it's hiding up there in the corner. So we wanted to make sure everyone was aware that where that big red arrow is, that is actually a button that pulls up just a plethora of information, and it's mostly what the students register with when they make their EC account. So some of that sports participation responses, demographic information, information about where they've attended schools, all can be kind of couched under this view registration data button. So something I would definitely recommend checking out. I know personally I use it a lot when I'm dealing with an international student athlete, because sometimes it backtracks on where they were, what institution were they attending, trying to navigate, could this be a split file? Are they entirely international? It's a great place that, where the student directly answered those questions already for the Eligibility Center. It's also a place to see, if you have an international student or a student that has participated in a sport that maybe had a significant amount of competition leading up to college, you can check that out and see if they did not put any participation responses in there. Conor and I were talking beforehand, sometimes that could be a red flag if they've never played a sport before, but they were international and a very high level or elite student athlete overseas. And I think that can sometimes be a flag for an amateurism concern from the NCAA's perspective. So again, just encouraging student athletes to always put as much information as possible into their registration data. And then now and again, reviewing that registration data as we're progressing through the recruitment process to make sure that everybody's sort of squared away before we get them final certified. So transitioning, I don't know if you have anything to add with the registration data.
No, I think it's a great source of information. You see international students sometimes report university level education and completely goes missed. That impacts the matriculation dates you enter, impacts whether they're being reviewed as an initial enrollee or perhaps a transfer student. So a lot of great information is ported into that view registration data. And I think it's definitely a link that you should be using as often as possible when you start looking at the accounts. And that brings us to our next section, which is the academic certification status. We didn't do a screenshot for this section because it's pretty large and it's hard to capture that onto a single slide. But in this section, you're going to see the ready to process date, which is aligned with the account's status in terms of conducting preliminary or final evaluations, making sure that all those transcripts are on file from each source of education that the student has attended. If it's multiple high schools, you need a transcript from each of those high schools to be on file. You'll also see other information about the core GPA. You'll see eligibility descriptions, which I tend to think of as markers for academic deficiencies, whether maybe the student is not meeting the 10-7 requirement, or perhaps has a social science or English deficiency, or perhaps a GPA deficiency for competition if they're, let's say, below a 2.2, for instance. You'll also see other details for like the international students on the new versus the old model. Make sure if you have an international recruit that you check out the academic information ported into the new and the old model sections. If you just look at the new model and the student's a final non-qualifier under the new or transcript-based model of analysis, you may be telling your coach in error that the student's not cleared, because if you scroll down further, you might find out the student met final qualifier standards under the old model. So make sure you check out both when you're working with your coaches and reviewing these accounts in the PSA detail report. You can also extract the full global list of information by clicking on the student's ID number. It's going to provide a comprehensive report for you that you can download. You can extract that in PDF. You can send those to your coaches. It contains information like the core courses that we've used, the the academic deficiencies, and so on and so forth. So clicking on the link on that PSA detail report, that link is embedded in the student's ID number, can also help you capture a lot of information to save on your desktop or to report to your coaches if they want to look through the student's account. On the next section below that is the amateurism certification status. It provides information about when the student has requested final amateurism certification, the date when they did that, the ready to process status, whether the student has responded to all amateurism related tasks, and any conditions that we may have assigned to the final amateurism decision. In this case, this particular Division I men's tennis student athlete has conditions, which those conditions will appear on the right-hand column to the right of the final certification requested column. So make sure you review that. And you'll also want to check out the documents section at the very bottom of the PSA detail report, where you can find that amateurism review summary and read through what the analysis was and why those conditions are set for that particular student. The next section down is going to be the high school information, which provides a list of the students' high schools that they've attended. By clicking on the high school link, and under the high school name, you can get to the school's profile in terms of finding out whether the school is cleared or perhaps not, what their core course lists are, whether, as Marisa just mentioned, what their grading scales are and whether those have changed between one year and the next. Archived courses or denied course titles that can't be used in our certifications. You'll also see a column that says the last time the school updated their core course list. So for this Laurel Springs school, the last time they've updated their core course list was in July of 2021. So it may be time for them to log into their high school portal and monitor and manage their core course list and make any other updates as needed. And then on the right of that, you'll see the high school transcript receipt date column indicating that we've received a transcript, or for the Indiana Virtual Academy, perhaps we haven't. And you have a phone number there where you can contact the school and ask them to submit high school transcripts to their high school portal and update their core course list. So that's a good thing to look at in the high school information section. Then in the next section, you'll see the student's task list, which is a very important section to check out. It's going to provide a full detailed list of all the tasks we've assigned, including open tasks, meaning those tasks have yet to receive a response. Now, I recommend that you review that task message and review them with your coaches and the student to make sure they're aware of those tasks. And also, I think as a best practice, it would be important to set expectations with the coach and student for when those students are planning to respond to those tasks. So make sure you review those open tasks and make sure those students are responding to those tasks as quickly as possible, unless, of course, it's a matriculation date task like the enrollment verification document needed task or the matriculation letter needed task. That's a job that you need to take care of in that matriculation letter option in the resource tabs drop-down menu. Now, if you have any questions about the tasks that we've assigned, and that's certainly possible, especially for those international students, you can contact customer service and we'll explain why those tasks were assigned and how to get responses to those tasks, or the student can respond to those tasks. So as Marisa mentioned earlier, contacting the EC staff can certainly be helpful to clear up why those tasks are assigned and what we're looking for. And that brings us basically to the end of the PSA details report. And I just want to take a couple seconds to discuss some upcoming changes to our academic record submission policies. Now, at present, students under the COVID relief flexibility that we've provided are still permitted to email in their records to the Eligibility Center using the email address that they use to log into their EC account. But that option ends at the very end of April 30th of 2024. Starting May 1st, we're going to return to the standard academic record submission policies, and I want to walk you through those steps here. As a best practice for those domestic students, I recommend that those high schools that they've attended upload their transcripts to their high school portal. That's a best option here. The high schools are occasionally pinged to do this periodically throughout the year to make sure they're doing this for all the students, so you don't have to do that extra legwork. But as you saw on the previous page, the Indiana Virtual Academy still needs to take care of this errand. So you may need to contact that high school if you don't see a transcript on the account. Schools can also email in these records. It's not ideal, but they can email those records in if they're a domestic school. They can send that to ec-processing@ncaa.org from a school registered email address. They just need to make sure that the student's name and ID number is on the subject line. And this is a good practice for international high schools who don't have that upload option in the Eligibility Center portal. They can email in those records to the same email address, also with the student's name and ID number on the subject line. And again, those need to be sent from school registered email addresses. You in the compliance office at your member institution, you also have the option of uploading academic records under the Upload Documents tab located under the Resources drop-down menu. If you submit academic records through your portal, this must include the academic record submission form, which is linked in the Resources section on the bottom right-hand column of the EC Resources page itself. So make sure that if you're uploading any documents, you include the academic record submission form in that submission with those academic records. You can also email in academic records to EC-processing, but it may take additional days to process that email and get those documents loaded onto the account and get that account updated. And if you email those records in, you must also include that academic record submission form. One final point here is on translation services. We get this question quite often in terms of translation services providing both translations and native language records for the international students when they need to translate from a native language document to English. We can accept translations from the translation services, but we will not accept native language records if they are emailed in by these translation services. So just kind of making that clear for your international students, if you ever need those translations, you can get them from the translation services, but those native language records need to be submitted by the high schools, those international high schools, which can email in those records to ec-processing@ncaa.org. You can upload them from your institution portal with the academic record submission form, and at least until April 30th, those international students can still email their records in. But after that point, that option closes out. So make sure you're on top of this and making sure your international students know that they need to start immediately submitting their records as early as possible before that date. So that takes us to the end of this discussion. We'll open it up for any questions that this audience has. Please enter that in the chat feature, and we'll try to field them in the next couple of minutes before this webinar ends.
And Conor, while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I do have a question for you. I know previously you mentioned activation and deactivation from an institution of request list. And I was just curious, could you speak on when you would say the best time to deactivate a student athlete would be? And I know a question I've received is surrounding things like official visits, right? We have to activate the student athlete.
Yep.
If we deactivate them, is there still a record of them being on our institutional request list?
Yes, we can see that the student had been activated, and we also see the deactivation date. We also see the date the NLI information was submitted, details like that. So even if you deactivate it, we still have a record of that deactivation date. So if you ever have any sort of audit that you need to conduct, you can contact us and we can get that information if you don't see that in your portal. In terms of the timing, that's maybe a better question for your institution and anyone's institution to answer. I tend to think that deactivation should occur after you discuss with the coach that is recruiting that student. If they're no longer planning to recruit that student, that should be an immediate signal to just deactivate the account and get that out of your way, and potentially even deprioritize it from our certification processing inventory. But other times to do this would be maybe after the student signs an NLI with another institution. It's not necessarily required, especially if you're anticipating the student to request a release from that NLI and get back into the recruiting stages for your institution. So there's no real good time to do that, but as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, actively managing your IRL list is important, whether it's you do the deactivations once a week or once a month, but whenever that happens, you can set your own schedule. And again, I want to encourage everyone to actively manage their institution request list. So it's a really good question there. And I guess the question for you is, when do you deactivate?
Yeah, honestly, I was curious. I didn't know in terms of keeping records. We try and keep them on for record keeping purposes internally. And then I would say once they sign with us or we go through national letter of intent period, and then regularly through the end of the academic year, I would say going into summer, I'll pull the list just to make sure no one is still being recruited as a walk-on or if they're still kind of on the horizon. Yeah. I think it's something, admittedly, everyone can pay closer attention to and make sure we're keeping it up to date, just because it's one of those things you'll be looking at it and thinking, where'd that person come from? And realize it's someone from a few months ago that sort of fell off the radar. So definitely a good reminder to keep it up to date. So I think we're sort of closing in at 2 o'clock here. Don't want to waste anybody's time as well, but thank you everyone for joining us. Just as a reminder, this webinar will be available after the fact. We hope to also publish the slides, so hopefully these can be utilized whether you are a newer compliance administrator that needs help navigating the Eligibility Center, or whether you're a more seasoned staff member. Hopefully you can utilize these to onboard a staff member and sort of answer those quick hitters about how to navigate and utilize the Eligibility Center.
And thanks, Marisa. And as we mentioned at the very beginning, this is a planned series of webinars to get new compliance administrators engaged with the Eligibility Center using the portal and understanding the mechanics of initial eligibility certifications. And in future webinars, we'll take you through additional stages based on the time of year to help you understand what you need to be doing at that time of year. And we look forward to presenting those future webinars in the coming months. So thank you, Marisa, and thank you to the NAAC Education Committee for putting this together.